There are moments in human history when evil reveals itself in ways so incomprehensible that even the most hardened investigators find themselves unable to sleep at night. There are confessions so disturbing, so detailed, so void of remorse that they shatter our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. And then there are monsters who walk among us, hiding in plain sight, wearing ordinary faces while carrying secrets darker than most of us could ever fathom. This is the story of one such monster, a man who claimed the lives of over 300 young girls across 3 South American countries, a killer so prolific that many criminologists consider him potentially the most lethal serial killer in modern recorded history. His name is Pedro Alonso López, but the world would come to know him by a name that still sends chills down the spines of anyone familiar with his crimes: the monster of the Andes. And perhaps the most terrifying part of this story isn't just the scale of his brutality, or the calculated methods he used to select his victims, or even the chilling lack of remorse he displayed when describing what he'd done. It's what happened after. It's the fact that after confessing to hundreds of murders, after personally leading police to dozens of tiny graves scattered across mountainsides and forests, after admitting in horrifying detail how he hunted, violated, and killed innocent children, he walked free. And today, nobody knows where he is. April 1980. The Andean highlands of Ecuador. The rainy season had arrived with a vengeance, transforming gentle streams into raging torrents and turning the mountainous terrain around Ambato into a treacherous landscape of mud and rushing water. Ambato, a city nestled at over 8,000 feet above sea level, was accustomed to heavy rains, but this year the storms seemed particularly relentless. The locals went about their lives as best they could, navigating flooded streets and hoping their homes would withstand nature's assault. When the flash flood hit the areas surrounding Ambato, it came with the sudden violence that mountain floods are known for. Water cascaded down steep slopes, carving new channels through forests and fields, uprooting trees and reshaping the landscape in a matter of hours. In its wake, the flood left behind debris, destroyed vegetation, and mud coating everything it had touched. But it also left something else, something that would change everything. As the waters receded and residents began assessing the damage, a discovery was made that turned routine flood cleanup into a nightmare. In the mud and debris, among the uprooted vegetation and scattered rocks, someone spotted something that didn't belong, something small, something that looked disturbingly human. It was the body of a young girl, and she wasn't alone. Within days, authorities had discovered the remains of 4 missing children in the flood zone, all girls, all between the ages of 8 and 12. Their bodies had been buried in shallow graves that the violent floodwaters had exposed, ripping away the thin layers of earth that had concealed them. The sight was devastating. These weren't recent deaths, the decomposition made that clear, but they weren't ancient remains either. These children had been alive not long ago. They'd had families. They'd had futures. The police in Ambato found themselves facing a horrifying reality. For months, maybe even years, young girls had been disappearing from the region. Families had filed missing persons reports. Mothers and fathers had searched desperately, asking neighbors, checking with relatives, praying their daughters had simply run away or been taken by human traffickers, because at least then there might be hope of finding them alive. The alternative, the possibility that these children were dead, was too painful to fully consider. But now that alternative was staring them in the face, muddy and decomposed and undeniable. The authorities began to connect the dots: the missing girls from Ambato, the reports from other regions of Ecuador about vanished children, the whispered fears in marketplaces and villages about a predator targeting young girls. It had all seemed like separate tragedies, isolated incidents, the unfortunate reality of poverty and vulnerability in rural communities. But what if it wasn't isolated at all? What if someone was hunting these children? What if there was a pattern? The investigation intensified. Police started looking more carefully at the recent disappearances, interviewing families, checking last known locations, trying to establish any commonalities. And as they dug deeper, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Many of the girls had last been seen in marketplaces. Many had been approached by a man offering money or trinkets. Many had simply vanished in broad daylight from crowded public spaces. Then came March 9, 1980, just days after the flood had revealed its terrible secrets. A Sunday morning at the Plaza Rosa marketplace in Ambato. The Plaza Rosa was alive with the energy that only South American markets possess. Vendors called out prices in rapid-fire Spanish, their voices competing with one another in a symphony of commerce. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, ripe mangoes, and the earthy smell of just-watered plants. Brightly colored textiles hung from stalls, swaying gently in the mountain breeze. Children darted between the displays, helping their mothers arrange merchandise or making deliveries to regular customers. Among the crowd that Sunday was a man in his early 30s, average height, dark hair, unremarkable in every physical respect. He wore plain clothes, nothing that would draw attention. His face was the kind you'd pass on the street without a second glance, the kind that blends into crowds and disappears from memory minutes after you've seen it. But some of the regular vendors at Plaza Rosa had started to notice him, not because he stood out, but because he kept coming back. Luz Marina Lozada, who sold flowers from her family's stall, had seen him multiple times over the past few weeks. Marina Cuenca, who ran a beverage stand with her mother, had turned down his offers to buy drinks from her on more than one occasion. There was something about him that made them uncomfortable. The way his eyes lingered on the youngest vendors, the way he'd approach with money in his hand, always seeming to prefer buying from children rather than adults. The questions he'd ask, trying to determine which girls worked alone, which ones might be unaccompanied, which families might be vulnerable. The women had talked among themselves, as vendors do when they spend day after day working side by side. They'd warned each other. They'd made sure to keep their daughters close. Some suspected he might be a human trafficker, scouting for potential targets. Trafficking was a known danger in Ecuador, especially for poor families, especially for young girls who could disappear into a dark underworld of exploitation and abuse. The thought was terrifying, but at least it was something they understood, something they could guard against. What they didn't suspect, what they couldn't have imagined, was the truth. That Sunday, the man approached a stall where 12-year-old Maria Povda was working alongside her mother, Carvana. He bought something small, made pleasant conversation, and then began walking away from the marketplace. Maria walked with him, just a few steps at first, then a few more. Her mother, Carvana, was helping another customer, but something made her look up. Some instinct, some primal maternal alarm caused her to glance in her daughter's direction. And she saw Maria leaving the marketplace with the strange man. Carvana didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to question or rationalize. Every protective instinct in her body screamed danger, and she listened. She called out for help, her voice cutting through the marketplace noise with the urgency of a mother whose child is in peril. The other vendors responded immediately. They recognized the man, the one they'd been warning each other about for weeks. Within seconds, merchants were abandoning their stalls, townspeople were joining the pursuit, and a growing crowd was chasing the man through the streets of Ambato. Maria was pulled away quickly, safe, confused about the commotion but unharmed. The man realized he was being followed and tried to disappear into the crowd, but these were locals who knew every alley and shortcut. They cornered him in a narrow street, and then rage took over. They knew what men like him did to children. They'd heard the stories, read the news reports, buried the victims. They knew that justice was slow and uncertain, that monsters sometimes walked free, that children disappeared and families mourned and nothing changed. In that moment, surrounded by furious vendors and grieving community members who'd lost daughters and nieces and neighbors, the man faced street justice. Fists flew, kicks landed. The crowd surged forward with the intention to kill him right there in that Ambato street. It was only the arrival of police officers that saved Pedro Alonso Lopez's life. Barely. The police pulled Lopez from the mob and dragged him, bruised and bloodied, to the station. He was booked for attempted kidnapping, a serious charge but one that carried a relatively modest sentence. The officers who processed him had no idea who they'd just arrested. They didn't know that the flash flood discoveries and this marketplace predator were connected. They couldn't have known that sitting in their holding cell was potentially the most prolific serial killer in modern history. Lopez wasn't talking. When questioned about the attempted abduction of Maria Povda, he gave minimal responses, admitted to nothing beyond being in the marketplace. The police had him on the attempted kidnapping. They had witnesses, but they couldn't connect him to anything else. Not yet. The breakthrough came from an unusual source. Detective Pastor Cordova Gudino had an idea, a risky one, but potentially effective. He would go undercover, posing as a fellow prisoner, and try to gain Lopez's trust. It was a psychological gambit, betting that Lopez might open up to someone he perceived as a peer rather than an authority figure. For 27 days, Gudino worked on building rapport with Lopez. They shared a cell. They talked about life, about women, about the injustices of the system. Slowly, carefully, Gudino presented himself as someone who understood, someone who didn't judge, someone Lopez could confide in. And gradually, incredibly, Lopez began to talk. At first it was hints, vague references to things he'd done, places he'd been. But Gudino was patient, never pushing too hard, always sympathetic, always encouraging Lopez to continue. And Lopez, starved perhaps for recognition, for someone to appreciate the full scope of what he'd accomplished, began to reveal more. He talked about Peru, about Colombia, about Ecuador. He talked about markets and villages and lonely roads. He talked about young girls with innocent faces and trusting smiles. And then, in fragments that would eventually form a horrifying whole, he began to confess to murder. Not just one murder, not a handful, hundreds. Gudino maintained his composure, continued to play the role of the understanding confidant, even as Lopez described atrocities that made the detective's stomach turn. When Lopez finally trusted him completely, Gudino made his move. He suggested that if Lopez could show the authorities where some of the bodies were buried, it might help his case, might demonstrate cooperation, might lead to a more lenient sentence. Lopez agreed. He said he could take them to the graves. He could show them where the girls were buried. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing chapters in criminal investigation history. Over the following weeks, Lopez led police on a macabre tour across the Ecuadorian highlands. He directed them to forests and ravines, to hillsides and secluded clearings. He pointed out landmarks and gave directions with the casual confidence of someone revisiting familiar places. And at each location, police began to dig. The first grave yielded the remains of a young girl, exactly where Lopez said she would be. Then another, and another. Each tiny skeleton was photographed, documented, carefully excavated. Each one represented a child who'd been reported missing, a family that had been searching, a life that had been stolen. By the time Lopez stopped leading them to burial sites, police had uncovered the remains of 53 girls. 53 shallow graves scattered across the Ecuadorian landscape. All of the victims were between 8 and 12 years old. All had been raped and murdered. All had been buried by the same hands. But Lopez insisted that there were more. He claimed that some of the graves he'd led them to were empty because animals had scattered the remains. He said there were additional sites in Peru and Colombia, places he could take them if they wanted to pursue those cases. And he claimed that his total victim count was somewhere around 300 girls. 300. The investigators didn't want to believe it. The number was too staggering, too incomprehensible. But Lopez provided details, locations, descriptions of victims that matched missing persons reports from across Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. He described methods, timelines, hunting grounds. And the more he talked, the more the terrible arithmetic began to add up. Ecuadorian authorities ultimately charged him with 110 murders based on his confessions to crimes committed within their jurisdiction. They didn't pursue charges for the claimed murders in Peru and Colombia, citing the enormous cost and complexity of international prosecutions. They had enough. They had his confession. They had the bodies. They had the monster of the Andes. To understand how someone becomes capable of such incomprehensible cruelty, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to October 8, 1948, in the Tolima department of Colombia, where Pedro Alonso López was born into circumstances that were already marked by violence and loss. His mother, Benilda López de Castañeda, was a laundry worker struggling to survive in a country torn apart by civil conflict. The family had formerly lived in Saldaña, but violence had driven them from their home. Pedro's father, Mirdo Reyes, was a rancher who was killed in an ambush shooting 6 months before Pedro was born. The murder occurred during La Violencia, a brutal period of Colombian history that would eventually claim over 200,000 lives. Pedro was the 7th of 13 children born to Benilda, and according to later accounts from both mother and son, his childhood was defined by poverty, chaos, and abuse. López would later claim that his mother was a sex worker who brought clients to their home, and that he witnessed violent assaults against her. He described her as physically abusive and cruel. Benilda, for her part, would maintain that she was a loving mother and that Pedro showed no abnormal behavior as a young child. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the complicated middle ground of memory, trauma, and self-serving narrative. What's not in dispute is that at age 8, Pedro was cast out of his home. The reason varies depending on the source. López claimed his mother caught him groping his younger sister and expelled him in rage. His mother said he ran away on his own on April 5, 1958, in an act of rebellion. Regardless of how it happened, an 8-year-old boy ended up homeless on the streets of Bogotá, Colombia's sprawling capital city. He became one of the gamines, the street children who survived through begging, petty theft, and the charity of strangers. It was a brutal existence, especially for a child so young and vulnerable. And then came the event that López would later describe as the moment that destroyed whatever innocence he had left. According to his account, a man approached him on the streets, offering shelter and food. Desperate and trusting, Pedro followed the man to an abandoned building. There, instead of receiving help, he was raped, violently, repeatedly. The man who had promised safety became his tormentor. This trauma, López would later claim, became the foundation for everything that followed. He told interviewers and psychiatrists that he lost his innocence at age 8, and that he decided to take the innocence of others in return. It's a narrative that attempts to create a cause and effect, to explain the unexplainable by pointing to childhood trauma as the origin of his later crimes. But trauma doesn't automatically create monsters. Millions of people endure horrific abuse as children and never harm anyone. The relationship between childhood suffering and adult violence is complex, mediated by countless other factors including individual psychology, subsequent experiences, choices, and the fundamental question of human agency and evil. What we know is that after the rape, young Pedro found his way to an orphanage run by American missionaries. It should have been a refuge, a chance for stability and healing. Instead, according to López's account, the abuse continued. He claimed that an older male caretaker at the orphanage sought him repeatedly. When he tried to fight back or escape, he was punished. By his teenage years, Pedro had learned that the world was a place of predators and prey, and he was determined never to be prey again. He ran away from the orphanage and returned to the streets, this time older, harder, more willing to do whatever was necessary to survive. He joined a street gang, smoked bazuco, an impure form of cocaine, and began committing petty crimes to get by. His first serious arrest came at age 18 for car theft. He was convicted and sent to prison, a Colombian facility that would become the setting for another traumatic event that López claims shaped his path toward becoming a killer. According to his account, he was raped by multiple inmates shortly after arriving. The violation, coming years after his childhood abuse, triggered something dark and irrevocable. López claimed that he vowed revenge, not against the specific men who'd attacked him, but against society itself. He somehow blamed young girls for the violence inflicted upon him by adult men, creating a twisted logic that would allow him to justify the unjustifiable. While still in prison in 1969, López killed 3 fellow inmates. The murders were brutal and premeditated. Authorities treated them as prison violence, an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence in the dangerous world of Colombian corrections. López received additional time, but eventually in 1978 he was released. He was 30 years old. He'd spent most of his life either on the streets, in institutions, or in prison. He'd been traumatized, abused, and brutalized. He'd also made choices, committed crimes, and hurt others. And now he was free, walking out of prison with a head full of violent fantasies and no one monitoring his movements or recognizing the danger he posed. What happened next would become a nightmare spanning 3 countries and hundreds of victims. After his release from Colombian prison in 1978, Pedro López began traveling. His movements took him across borders into Peru, a country with vast rural areas, vulnerable populations, and indigenous communities whose missing children often went unreported or uninvestigated by authorities. It was in Peru, López would later claim, that he began his systematic killing spree. He developed a method, a pattern that would remain remarkably consistent throughout his years of murder. He would travel to small towns and villages, places where poverty was endemic and children often helped their families by working in markets or performing tasks that required them to be in public, sometimes alone. López described his victim selection process with chilling clarity in later interviews. He would walk through markets and village centers, watching, evaluating, searching for what he called a certain look of innocence. He preferred girls between 8 and 12 years old, young enough to be trusting, vulnerable enough to be easily controlled. He looked for children who appeared to be from poor families, who worked alongside their mothers, who had that quality he found appealing, innocence combined with beauty. Once he'd selected a target, he would observe her for days, learning her routine, identifying moments when she might be separated from her family. Then he would approach, usually offering something enticing, a trinket, a small toy, money, or the promise of a gift for her mother. He would engage the child in conversation, building just enough rapport to convince her to walk with him to the edge of town, where he claimed to have something special to give her. Once they were isolated, the pretense would drop. López would overpower the child and take her to a pre-selected location, somewhere secluded where screams couldn't be heard and interruptions were unlikely. Often these were places where he'd already dug shallow graves. What happened in those final hours was described by López himself in interviews that remain some of the most disturbing confessions ever recorded. He would keep the girls alive, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. He would grape them, often multiple times. And then, he said, he would wait for sunrise. According to his account, dawn was his preferred time for killing. As the first light appeared on the horizon, he would position himself to look directly into the victim's eyes. Then he would strangle them, slowly, watching their faces as the life drained away. He described it as the ultimate form of possession, claiming their souls at the moment of death by being the last thing they saw. After they were dead, López said he would spend time making absolutely certain they were gone. He'd check for breathing using a mirror. He'd cut their wrists or throats to see if blood was still pumping. If there was any sign of life remaining, he'd strangle them again. "Sometimes I had to kill them all over again," he told one interviewer with disturbing casualness. Then came the burial. López would place the bodies in the shallow graves he'd prepared, sometimes putting multiple victims in the same pit. In one of his most chilling admissions, he described returning to these mass graves to visit with the dead girls, talking to them as if they were still alive, telling them about his day and his new friends that he was bringing to join them. It was like having a party, he said. In Peru alone, Lopez claimed to have killed over 100 girls between 1978 and 1980. The exact number may never be known, because many of his victims came from indigenous communities or were street children whose disappearances went largely unrecorded by official authorities. But his spree in Peru nearly ended in 1978 when he made a mistake. He attempted to abduct a 9-year-old girl from an Ayacucho village, but this time the community caught him. Members of the local indigenous tribe apprehended Lopez and prepared to execute him according to their traditional justice practices. They planned to bury him alive, covered in syrup to attract fire ants, a prolonged and agonizing death. Lopez was moments away from this fate when an American missionary intervened. The missionary, believing in due process and formal justice, convinced the tribal members to hand Lopez over to the Peruvian police instead of executing him themselves. It was a decision made with good intentions, a belief in the rule of law and the value of mercy. It was also a decision that would indirectly lead to the deaths of dozens, possibly hundreds, more young girls. Because the Peruvian authorities didn't prosecute Lopez, they didn't investigate his background, they didn't connect him to the missing girls in the regions where he'd been traveling. They simply deported him across the border into Colombia as an undesirable foreign national. They got rid of their problem by making him someone else's problem. Back in Colombia, Lopez didn't stop, but he also didn't stay. He moved to Ecuador, crossing into a new hunting ground where his face wasn't known and his pattern could continue uninterrupted. Ecuador provided Lopez with what he would later describe as ideal conditions for his crimes. The country had significant rural poverty, busy marketplaces where children worked alongside their families, and indigenous populations whose missing children often failed to generate significant police attention or media coverage. Lopez would later tell investigators and journalists that he preferred Ecuadorian girls. "They are more gentle and trusting, more innocent," he explained. "They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls." It was a statement that revealed his predatory calculation, his understanding of cultural differences, and how they could be exploited. In Ecuador, Lopez's killing accelerated to what he described as a consistent pattern of 3 girls a week. If that claim is accurate, and if it was sustained over the approximately 2 years he operated in Ecuador, the mathematics alone are staggering. 3 victims per week, 52 weeks a year for 2 years, would equal over 300 girls just in Ecuador. Authorities would ultimately accept his confession to 110 murders in Ecuador as credible based on the evidence, the burial sites, and the matching of his accounts to missing persons reports. But the true number may have been far higher. Lopez's method in Ecuador remained consistent with what he'd developed in Peru. He would travel from town to town, never staying in one place long enough to be recognized or connected to the disappearances. He frequented marketplaces on busy days, especially Sundays when farmers and families came to town to sell goods and socialize. He dressed simply and behaved unremarkably. Witnesses who saw him before or during attempted abductions described him as polite, soft-spoken, non-threatening. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like anyone, and that ordinariness was part of what made him so dangerous. The graves he dug were scattered across the Ecuadorian highlands, in forests near Ambato, in remote areas near Santo Domingo, near villages in La Troncal, Tulcan, Quito, Azogues, Manta, and Salcedo. He created what was essentially a hidden graveyard spanning nearly every province of Ecuador, each site containing the remains of 1 or more children who'd been reported missing and never found. Until the flood. The April 1980 flash flood that exposed 4 bodies in the Ambato area wasn't just a natural disaster. It was the event that finally revealed what had been happening in the shadows. Those 4 girls, whose remains were washed into visibility by raging water, became the evidence that couldn't be ignored. Their deaths, and the investigation that followed, led directly to Lopez's arrest at the Plaza Rosa marketplace just days later. When Lopez was caught trying to abduct Maria Povda, when the angry crowd nearly beat him to death, when the police pulled him into custody, the pieces finally started coming together. The flood victims, the missing girls, the marketplace predator, the pattern. And once Detective Gudino earned Lopez's confession and Lopez began leading police to graves, the full scope of the horror became undeniable. Pedro López's trial began in 1980 in the court of Ambato, presided over by Judge José Roberto Cobos Moscoso. The proceedings would become a source of frustration and outrage for victims' families, law enforcement, and the general public alike. Lopez was charged with 57 counts of murder related to the bodies that had been recovered, and the confessions he'd provided regarding crimes committed within Ecuador. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: Lopez's detailed confessions, his knowledge of burial locations, the recovered remains of 53 girls matching missing persons reports, witness testimony about his behavior in marketplaces, and expert analysis linking the crimes to a single perpetrator. Lopez pleaded guilty. There was no question of his culpability, no insanity defense that might have provided an alternative narrative. He admitted to everything. In fact, he seemed almost eager to discuss his crimes, to ensure that people understood the full scope of what he'd accomplished. On July 31, 1981, the 33-year-old Lopez was officially convicted and sentenced. The sentence: 16 years in prison. 16 years. For murdering at least 57 girls, with credible confessions to over 100 total in Ecuador alone. The reason for what many considered an incomprehensibly lenient sentence was simple. 16 years was the maximum prison term allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time for any crime, including murder. No matter how many people someone killed, no matter how heinous the crimes, the legal maximum was 16 years. The public outrage was immediate and intense. Families of victims were devastated. How could the life of a child be worth so little in the eyes of the law? How could someone who'd confessed to over 300 murders across 3 countries potentially walk free after just 16 years? Editorials condemned the sentence. Protests were organized. Victims' advocacy groups demanded changes to the law. The case sparked a national conversation about justice, punishment, and whether the legal system was adequate to address crimes of such magnitude. Ecuador would eventually change its laws, extending the maximum prison sentence to 25 years, but the change came too late to affect Lopez's sentence. He was sent to Garcia Moreno prison in Quito to serve his time, officially diagnosed as a sociopath, a clinical assessment that surprised no one who'd heard his confessions or read the details of his crimes. In prison, Lopez initially received the treatment one might expect for someone convicted of murdering dozens of children. Other inmates knew who he was and what he'd done. Child killers are despised even in the brutal social hierarchy of prisons, and Lopez faced violence and isolation. But as the years passed and media attention faded, Lopez settled into a routine. He participated in prison programs. He reportedly behaved well, following rules and avoiding major disciplinary incidents. Guards who interacted with him described him as polite, quiet, unremarkable. The monster could mimic normalcy when it suited his interests. And then, in 1994, after serving just 14 years of his 16-year sentence, Pedro López was released for good behavior. In 1994, before his release from Garcia Moreno prison, Lopez granted an interview to Ron Leitner, a freelance photojournalist who'd been reporting on the case. The interview, conducted in Lopez's prison cell, would become one of the most disturbing documents in the history of criminal journalism. Leitner described Lopez as calm, articulate, and completely unrepentant. There was no shame, no remorse, no acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong. Instead, Lopez spoke about his crimes with a philosophical detachment, as if discussing an interesting hobby or academic pursuit. When asked about his victim count, Lopez calmly explained his arithmetic. At least 110 in Ecuador, perhaps 100 in Colombia, and many more than 100 in Peru. He spoke about the numbers the way someone might discuss baseball statistics or business profits, abstract figures disconnected from the reality of hundreds of individual human lives destroyed. He described his selection process, explaining how he would walk through markets, searching for a girl with a certain look on her face, a look of innocence and beauty. He talked about following potential victims for days, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to approach. When discussing his preference for Ecuadorian girls over Colombian or Peruvian victims, Lopez made the chilling comparison that would become one of his most quoted statements. "It's like eating chicken. Why eat old chicken when you can have young chicken?" He explained his ritual of waiting for dawn to kill his victims, describing how he would get excited at the first sign of light, how he would grape the girls and then strangle them as the sun rose. "I was very considerate," he said with grotesque self-congratulation. "I would spend a long time with them making sure they were dead. I would use a mirror to check whether they were still breathing." Perhaps most disturbing was his description of returning to the graves to visit with his victims. "I often put 3 or 4 girls in a single hole and talked to them," he told Leitner. "It was like having a party, but after a while, because they couldn't move, I got bored and went out looking for new girls." Throughout the interview, Lopez attempted to justify his actions by referencing his own childhood trauma. "I lost my innocence at age 8, he explained, "so I decided to do the same to as many young girls as I could." It was a narrative of victimhood transmuted into perpetration, an attempt to create a logical progression from suffering to inflicting suffering. But the interview also revealed something else: Lopez's complete lack of understanding that what he'd done was fundamentally, morally, cosmically wrong. He didn't seem to comprehend why people were horrified by his actions. He spoke about the girls as possessions, as objects that existed for his use and disposal. There was no empathy, no recognition of their humanity, no acknowledgement of the families destroyed or the futures stolen. Leitner left the interview deeply shaken. The story he published would circulate internationally, bringing renewed attention to the case and to the fact that this man, this self-described monster who'd killed hundreds of children, was about to walk free. In 1994, Pedro López was released from Garcia Moreno prison, having served only 14 years of his already inadequate 16-year sentence. The release sparked immediate outcry. Victims' families protested. International media covered the story with headlines expressing disbelief. How could someone who'd confessed to over 300 murders be released after just 14 years? But Ecuadorian authorities had limited options. Lopez had served his sentence according to the law as it existed at the time of his conviction. They couldn't retroactively extend his punishment. However, they could make sure he was no longer Ecuador's problem. Lopez was immediately deported to Colombia, handed over to Colombian authorities with documentation of his confessed crimes in their country. Colombia faced the same dilemma that Peru had years earlier: what to do with a confessed serial killer whose crimes were largely unprovable due to lack of physical evidence, missing witnesses, and the passage of time. The solution Colombia chose was psychiatric commitment. Lopez was evaluated by mental health professionals who determined that he was insane, a diagnosis that allowed authorities to commit him to a psychiatric hospital in Bogotá rather than releasing him to the general public. For 4 years, Lopez remained in psychiatric care, presumably receiving treatment for his diagnosed sociopathy and any other conditions the doctors identified. But in 1998, another shocking development occurred. López was declared sane. After being evaluated again, mental health professionals determined that López no longer met the criteria for involuntary commitment. He was released from the psychiatric hospital on $50 bail, with certain conditions attached to his freedom. He was supposed to check in regularly with authorities. He was supposed to stay in a specific location. He was supposed to be monitored. But monitoring only works if someone is actually doing the monitoring. And within months of his release, Pedro López simply disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of López was in December 1999. According to some reports, he returned to visit his elderly mother, Benilda, seeking money that he believed was owed to him as part of an inheritance. Whether that visit actually occurred and what transpired during it remains unclear. What is clear is that after that point, López vanished. He didn't check in with authorities as required. He didn't remain at his designated location. He simply walked away from whatever minimal supervision was in place and disappeared into the vast, anonymous landscape of South America. Then, in 2002, something happened that suggested López might have resumed killing. A murder was committed in Colombia, and evidence pointed to López as the suspect. An arrest warrant was issued, and López became an official fugitive wanted for questioning in connection with a new homicide. But he couldn't be found. Interpol issued an alert. Colombian authorities searched. Nothing. Pedro López had become a ghost. For years, the international warrant remained active. Law enforcement in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru kept his file open, hopping for a sighting, a tip, any information that might lead to his capture. Victims' families held on to hope that he would be found and held accountable for the crimes that had never been prosecuted. Then, in 2005, Interpol deactivated the warrant. The reasons for this decision remain unclear and controversial. Some sources suggest it was a routine administrative action based on the age of the case and the unlikelihood of apprehension. Others speculate that authorities had information suggesting López was dead, though no body was ever recovered or death certificate issued. As of 2026, Pedro López's whereabouts remain unknown. He would be 77 years old if he's still alive. He could be living under an assumed name in a remote village. He could have died years ago from natural causes or violence. He could have resumed killing in places where his crimes continue to go undetected. Nobody knows. And that uncertainty haunts the families of his victims, the investigators who worked his case, and the communities across 3 countries that still remember the terror of the monster of the Andes. Behind every statistic, every number in López's horrifying victim count, was a real child with a name, a family, a personality, dreams and fears, and a future that was stolen from them. They were girls like Ivanova Jacome, abducted from a parking lot in Tataras on January 10, 1980, as she was heading to school. 10 years old. Her body was discovered weeks later in Ambato's Plaza Urbina, another victim in a pattern that nobody had yet connected. They were indigenous children whose names often went unrecorded in official databases, girls from remote villages who disappeared while helping their families, whose absence was noted by grieving communities, but not always by authorities who viewed indigenous lives as less worthy of investigation and resources. They were street children, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, kids who lived on the margins of society, and whose disappearances were sometimes dismissed as runaways or attributed to the dangers of street life, rather than investigated as potential homicides. Each of them was someone's daughter. Each of them had a mother who searched, who hoped, who prayed for their return. Each disappearance left a wound in a family that never fully healed. The families of López's victims faced a unique kind of torment. Unlike families of missing persons whose loved ones are never found, they eventually received confirmation that their daughters were dead, that their worst fears were realized. But unlike families whose loved ones are murdered by criminals who face appropriate punishment, they watched López receive an absurdly light sentence and then walk free after barely a decade in prison. Many of these families never received justice in any meaningful sense. The murders committed in Peru and Colombia were never prosecuted. Even in Ecuador, where López was convicted, the sentence was so inadequate that it felt like a mockery of justice. And when López disappeared after his release, even the small consolation of knowing he was locked away was taken from them. The psychological impact on surviving family members is difficult to quantify but impossible to overstate. Mothers who saw their daughters walk away with a smiling stranger and never return. Fathers who searched for months, checking hospitals and morgues, hopping against hope. Siblings who grew up in the shadow of a sister's absence, in homes where grief became a permanent resident. And the communities themselves were changed. Parents in Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia became more protective, more suspicious of strangers, more fearful of allowing their children any independence. The marketplace, traditionally a space of community and commerce, became tinged with danger. The trust that allows societies to function was damaged by the knowledge that monsters could be hiding in plain sight. The case of Pedro López represents multiple systemic failures that compounded one another with devastating consequences. First was the failure to track and monitor a known violent offender across international borders. When López was caught by the indigenous tribe in Peru and handed over to police, that should have been a red flag. An investigation into his background, his travels, the missing children in areas where he'd been active, might have stopped him before he killed again. Instead, he was simply deported, sent to become another country's problem. Second was the failure of Ecuador's legal system to have adequate sentencing provisions for crimes of extraordinary magnitude. 16 years maximum for any number of murders, no matter how heinous, was a legal framework that couldn't address the reality of serial killers. By the time the law was changed, it was too late for López's victims. Third was the failure to adequately monitor López after his release. Whether in Ecuador's hands before deportation, Colombia's hands after he was committed to psychiatric care, or during his supposed supervision after being declared sane, there were multiple points where better oversight might have prevented his disappearance and potentially stopped any subsequent crimes. Fourth was the broader societal failure to protect the most vulnerable children, those from indigenous communities, those living in poverty, those working on the streets. López selected his victims from these populations precisely because he understood that their disappearances were less likely to generate aggressive police action or sustained media attention. The case also raises profound questions about the nature of evil, questions that philosophers and psychologists have grappled with throughout history. Can childhood trauma explain López's actions without excusing them? Is someone who commits such crimes insane by definition, or is López's sociopathy a different category entirely, a personality disorder that doesn't preclude understanding right from wrong? López himself seemed to believe he was making rational choices. He described his victim selection, his methods, his rituals, all with a calculated precision that suggests planning and intentionality. He wasn't acting on uncontrollable impulses. He was executing a systematic program of hunting, rape, and murder. That's not insanity in the legal sense. That's evil, deliberate, and conscious. And if López is still alive somewhere, living under an assumed name, watching the years go by while his victims remain forever frozen at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, what does that say about justice? What does it say about our ability as a society to protect the innocent and punish the guilty? As this case recedes further into history, certain questions remain stubbornly unanswered, ghosts that continue to haunt anyone who studies the crimes of Pedro López. First and most fundamental, Did he really kill over 300 girls? López himself claimed that number, providing specific regional breakdowns that added up to around 350 victims. Authorities accepted his confession to 110 murders in Ecuador as credible based on physical evidence and matching missing persons reports. But the Peru and Colombia numbers were never fully verified. Some experts believe the true count may be even higher than 300. They point to the unsolved disappearances of young girls in regions where López traveled, to the gaps in his known timeline where his whereabouts and activities are unclear, to the possibility that he'd been killing for longer than he admitted. Others suggest that López might have exaggerated his victim count, inflating the numbers to achieve notoriety, to be recognized as one of history's most prolific killers. Narcissism is common among serial killers, and López certainly displayed signs of wanting credit and recognition for his crimes. The truth likely falls somewhere in between, but without exhaustive investigations in Peru and Colombia, without excavations at all the sites López claimed to have used, we'll never know the exact number. And that uncertainty means there are families who don't know if their missing daughters were López's victims or if they disappeared for other reasons. There's no closure, no definitive answer. Second question, is Pedro López still alive? If he is, he'd be 77 years old in 2026. It's entirely possible he died years ago from natural causes, from violence, from any of the mundane ways that people die. But without a body, without a death certificate, without confirmation, there's no way to know. Some investigators believe he's dead, pointing to the lack of any confirmed sightings since 1999, the absence of any new crimes that match his pattern, the statistical likelihood that he wouldn't have survived this long given his age and the dangerous life of a fugitive. Others believe he could still be alive, living quietly somewhere, perhaps in a remote area where he's unknown, perhaps in a city where he's just another anonymous elderly man. Third question, if he is alive, did he resume killing? The 2002 murder warrant suggests that at least Colombian authorities suspected he'd killed again. But that case was never solved, López was never apprehended, and there's been no public information about whether investigators found evidence linking him to additional crimes. If López is alive and hasn't killed again, it would represent an unusual pattern for serial killers of his type. Most don't simply stop, especially someone whose crimes were as compulsive and systematic as López's appeared to be. But age could be a factor. A man in his 70s doesn't have the same physical ability to overpower victims or the same energy to engage in the stalking and hunting that his crimes required. Or perhaps he did resume killing, and the murders simply haven't been connected to him. If he's operating in remote areas, targeting vulnerable populations whose disappearances don't generate significant police attention, it's possible his crimes could be continuing undetected even now. Fourth question, could this happen again? Could another predator operate on this scale in modern South America without being caught more quickly? The answer is complicated. On one hand, improvements in forensic science, better communication between law enforcement agencies across borders, DNA databases, and increased public awareness about child predators should make it harder for someone to kill with López's frequency and duration, without being identified and apprehended. On the other hand, the fundamental vulnerabilities that López exploited, poverty, social marginalization of indigenous communities, street children, gaps in law enforcement coverage in rural areas, these conditions still exist. As long as there are vulnerable children whose disappearances don't generate immediate and aggressive police response, there's potential for predators to operate. In the end, what can we say about the case of Pedro López, the monster of the Andes? We can say with certainty that he's one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded modern history, responsible for at least 110 confirmed murders, and possibly 2 to 3 times that many based on credible confessions. We can say that his crimes reveal the terrible vulnerability of certain populations, particularly poor children, indigenous children, and those living on the margins of society, whose lives are valued less by systems of law and justice. We can say that multiple institutions failed, repeatedly and catastrophically, at every level from local police to national governments to international law enforcement cooperation. Each failure created an opportunity for López to continue killing, and the accumulated weight of those failures represents hundreds of stolen lives. We can say that the families of his victims were denied justice in any meaningful sense, first by inadequate laws that limited his sentence, then by his early release, and finally by his disappearance into a freedom he never deserved. We can say that somewhere, scattered across the highlands of Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, there are graves that have never been found, children whose remains have never been recovered, families who still don't know for certain what happened to their daughters. And we can say that Pedro López, whether alive or dead, whether free or hiding or buried in an unmarked grave himself, remains a symbol of evil at its most incomprehensible, proof that monsters are real and that sometimes they walk among us wearing ordinary faces. The mothers at Plaza Rosa Marketplace in Ambato were right to be suspicious of the quiet man who kept coming back, who kept hovering around their daughters. Their instincts, honed by the universal protective love that mothers have for their children, detected something that law enforcement and justice systems failed to recognize until it was far too late. Their intervention saved Maria Povda. Their pursuit led to López's capture. Their courage in facing down a predator nearly resulted in street justice that would have ended his life right there. And while we can debate the morality of vigilante violence, we can't deny that if that crowd had succeeded, if those angry vendors and grieving community members had taken López's life before police arrived, hundreds of girls might still be alive in Peru and Colombia. That's the terrible arithmetic of this case. The missionary who saved López from the indigenous tribe in Peru believed he was doing the right thing, choosing mercy and due process over brutal execution. But that mercy allowed López to kill potentially 100 more girls in Ecuador. The Ecuadorian laws that limited his sentence to 16 years were designed to be humane, to reject the death penalty and life imprisonment as barbaric. But that humanity translated directly into López's freedom and disappearance. These are the impossible moral calculations that emerge from cases like this, questions without satisfying answers, dilemmas that pit our highest ideals against brutal pragmatism. One aspect of López's crimes that particularly disturbed investigators and psychologists was his apparent ability to completely compartmentalize his actions, to separate the man who committed atrocities from the man who interacted normally with society. Prison guards described him as polite and cooperative. Fellow inmates who weren't aware of his crimes found him unremarkable, even pleasant to talk to. He could discuss current events, tell jokes, participate in prison programs, all while harboring memories of hundreds of murders and feeling no apparent guilt or remorse. This ability to mimic normalcy, to present a socially acceptable facade while maintaining an inner landscape of violence and depravity, is characteristic of psychopaths. But López took it to an extreme degree. He wasn't just hiding his crimes. He was genuinely unable to understand why others found them horrifying. In his interviews, López expressed confusion and even offense that people viewed him as a monster. He saw his victims as objects, as possessions he'd collected and disposed of, no different from someone who collects stamps or coins and then throws them away when they lose interest. The concept that these were human beings with inherent value, with families who loved them with potential futures, seemed completely foreign to him. Dr. Jorge Patiño, one of the Colombian psychiatrists who evaluated López, noted that he showed no capacity for empathy whatsoever. It wasn't that López chose not to feel empathy. He was neurologically and psychologically incapable of it. The parts of his brain that should have generated feelings of connection, compassion, or moral restraint appeared to be essentially absent or non-functional. This raises disturbing questions about culpability and punishment. If someone is fundamentally incapable of understanding that murder is wrong, can they be held morally responsible for their actions? Or are they more like natural disasters, dangerous forces that need to be contained, but can't be blamed in any meaningful sense? The legal system in most countries rejects this argument, maintaining that as long as someone understands that their actions will cause harm, and that society prohibits those actions, they can be held criminally responsible even if they don't feel the emotional weight of that harm. By this standard, Lopez was absolutely culpable. He knew that killing was illegal. He took extensive steps to avoid being caught, and he understood on an intellectual level that his victims' families would suffer. But the philosophical question remains unsettled. What do we do with people who are broken in such fundamental ways? How do we protect society from predators who will never, can never, be reformed or rehabilitated? While much of the attention in this case focused on Lopez himself, on understanding his psychology and tracking his movements, less attention was paid to comprehensively identifying and memorializing his victims. Many of the girls he killed were from indigenous communities where record-keeping was informal, where births might not be officially registered, where disappearances were noted by the community but not always reported to authorities who'd historically shown little interest in indigenous concerns. Many were street children who'd already been abandoned by families, by society, by systems that should have protected them. They had no one to file missing persons reports, no one to pressure police for investigations, no one to ensure their deaths were recorded and their lives remembered. This anonymity was part of what allowed Lopez to kill so prolifically. He understood that certain lives are valued less by society, that certain deaths generate less attention and fewer consequences. He selected victims from populations that were already marginalized, already invisible, already forgotten by the systems of justice and protection that serve wealthier, more connected communities. Even among the victims whose remains were recovered in Ecuador, many were never positively identified. The bodies had been buried too long, decomposition was too advanced, and forensic technology in 1980 Ecuador wasn't capable of the kind of DNA analysis that might be possible today. They were buried as unknown girls, their graves marked with generic markers, their true names lost to history. The families of these unidentified victims faced a unique torture. They knew their daughters were missing. They knew that a man had confessed to murdering over 100 girls in Ecuador. But they didn't know if their specific child was among the recovered remains, or if she was still somewhere out there, buried in a grave that was never found, lost forever in the vast landscape of the Andes. Some families conducted their own searches, hiking into remote areas, looking for any sign, any indication that their daughter might be there. Most found nothing. The mountains and forests of the Andean highlands are vast and unforgiving, and Lopez had chosen his burial sites specifically for their isolation and inaccessibility. Organizations attempted to create comprehensive lists of Lopez's victims, to give names and faces to the statistics, to ensure that each girl was remembered as an individual rather than a number in a serial killer's tally. But the gaps in records, the passage of time, and the jurisdictional boundaries between three countries made this task nearly impossible. Today, there are memorials in some of the Ecuadorian communities that lost children to Lopez. Small plaques with names, flowers placed by families who still mourn decades later, photographs of smiling girls forever frozen in childhood. These memorials serve as reminders not just of what was lost, but of the responsibility we all share to protect the most vulnerable among us. The trauma of Lopez's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims and their families, rippling outward to affect entire communities, and even influencing cultural attitudes across South America. In the regions where López hunted most actively, a generation of parents raised their children with heightened fear and protectiveness. The marketplaces where he'd selected many of his victims became places of anxiety rather than joyful commerce. Mothers who'd previously allowed their daughters to work independently at market stalls now insisted on constant supervision. The autonomy that children had traditionally enjoyed in these communities was restricted, constrained by the knowledge of what had happened and the fear that it could happen again. Child psychologists in Ecuador noted increases in anxiety disorders among children growing up in the affected communities, even children born after López was captured. The collective trauma had been absorbed into the culture, transmitted from one generation to the next through overprotective parenting, through stories told as warnings, through the visible memorials to murdered children. For law enforcement officers and investigators who worked the case, the psychological toll was equally severe. Many described nightmares, depression, and symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Marco Almeida, one of the forensic investigators who excavated grave sites, later sought therapy for recurring dreams about the tiny skeletons he'd unearthed, about the children who died alone and afraid in remote forests. Detective Pastor Cordova Gudino, who'd spent 27 days gaining López's trust and listening to his confessions, struggled with guilt. He'd done his job brilliantly, extracting information that led to the recovery of dozens of bodies and the conviction of a serial killer. But he'd had to listen to detailed descriptions of child rape and murder, had to suppress his revulsion, and maintain a sympathetic facade, had to essentially befriend a monster. The psychological cost of that deception, of that exposure to extreme evil, was something Cordova carried for the rest of his life. Judge José Roberto Cobos Moscoso, who presided over López's trial, faced public criticism for the 16-year sentence, even though he was simply applying the maximum punishment allowed under existing law. He received death threats from families who felt justice had been denied. He struggled with the knowledge that he'd been forced to hand down a sentence that was manifestly inadequate for the crimes committed. Even the journalists who covered the case, who interviewed López and reported on the discovery of burial sites, experienced vicarious trauma. Ron Leitner, whose 1994 interview with López became famous for its disturbing revelations, described feeling contaminated by the encounter, as if he'd been exposed to something toxic that couldn't be washed away. This secondary trauma, affecting everyone who came into contact with the case in any professional capacity, is itself a form of victimization. López's crimes created circles of harm that extended far beyond his direct victims, damaging the mental health and well-being of hundreds or thousands of people across 3 countries. The López case exposed significant weaknesses in international law enforcement cooperation, particularly regarding the tracking of serial offenders who cross national borders. In the 1970s and early 1980s, there was no comprehensive system for sharing information about criminals, missing persons, or unsolved cases between Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. Each country maintained its own databases and records, with little communication or coordination between jurisdictions. This meant that when López was captured by the indigenous tribe in Peru and then released by Peruvian police, there was no mechanism to flag him to Ecuadorian authorities when he crossed the border. When girls went missing in regions near the borders between countries, there was no systematic way to determine if the cases might be connected, or if a perpetrator might be operating across multiple jurisdictions. The gaps that López exploited have since been partially addressed through improved Interpol systems, better communication protocols between South American law enforcement agencies, and increased awareness of the importance of tracking cross-border criminals. But significant vulnerabilities remain, particularly when it comes to crimes against marginalized populations, whose disappearances might not be immediately reported or investigated. The case also highlighted the challenges of prosecuting international crimes when evidence is scattered across multiple countries with different legal systems, evidentiary standards, and levels of resources. Ecuador pursued charges against López because they had the bodies, the physical evidence, and the resources to mount a prosecution. Peru and Colombia chose not to pursue cases despite López's confessions, in part because the costs of investigation and prosecution would have been enormous and the likelihood of additional punishment minimal, given his Ecuadorian sentence. This created a situation where López was never held accountable for the vast majority of his claimed victims, where families in Peru and Colombia received even less justice than families in Ecuador, where entire portions of his killing spree remain officially unacknowledged and unpunished. International human rights organizations have since used the López case as an example of why cross-border cooperation and standardized protocols for handling serial offenders are necessary. But implementation of these improvements has been slow and uneven, constrained by national sovereignty concerns, resource limitations, and competing priorities. The media coverage of Pedro López's crimes evolved significantly over the decades, reflecting changing attitudes about how to report on serial killers and whether giving them attention serves the public interest or merely satisfies their narcissism. In the immediate aftermath of his 1980 arrest, media coverage in Ecuador was extensive but relatively straightforward, reporting on the grave discoveries, the trial proceedings, and the reactions of victims' families. López was portrayed as a monster, a predator, an embodiment of evil that needed to be locked away from society. But as the years passed and López's release approached, a different kind of coverage emerged. Journalists began interviewing him, publishing his words, allowing him a platform to explain his perspective and his crimes. The Ron Leitner interview in 1994 was the most famous of these, providing López with an international audience for his claims and his justifications. This type of coverage is controversial. On one hand, it provides valuable insight into the psychology of serial killers, potentially helping law enforcement and mental health professionals better understand and identify similar offenders. On the other hand, it arguably glorifies the killers, gives them the attention and recognition they crave, and can inspire copycat crimes. López clearly enjoyed the attention his case received. In his interviews, he often compared himself to other famous serial killers, nodding with apparent pride that his victim count exceeded theirs. He seemed to want recognition as one of history's most prolific murderers, to be studied and remembered and feared. When his case was featured in true crime documentaries, books, and television programs, it ensured that his name would be remembered even as his victims' names were largely forgotten. This imbalance, where we know extensive details about the killer's life, psychology, and methods, but can't name most of his victims, reflects a broader problem in how society and media approach these cases. In recent years, there's been a shift toward victims first reporting that attempts to center the stories of those who were harmed rather than glorifying the perpetrator. But for historical cases like López's, much of the existing media coverage still focuses primarily on him, perpetuating his presence in public consciousness, while his victims remain largely anonymous. At the heart of the Pedro López case is a question that humanity has grappled with throughout history. Are monsters born or made? López himself promoted a narrative of victimization leading to perpetration. He claimed that his childhood trauma, the sexual abuse he suffered at ages 8 and 18, destroyed his capacity for normalcy and created the killer he became. This narrative serves several purposes for López. It provides an explanation for his actions, it positions him as a victim himself, and it suggests that his crimes were somehow inevitable rather than chosen. But this explanation is too convenient and too incomplete. Millions of people experience childhood trauma, including sexual abuse, without becoming serial killers. The vast majority of abuse survivors never harm anyone, and many dedicate their lives to protecting others from the suffering they endured. The relationship between early trauma and later violence is real but complex. Childhood abuse can damage developing brains, particularly regions involved in emotional regulation, empathy, and impulse control. It can create maladaptive coping mechanisms and distorted views of relationships and power, but it doesn't automatically or inevitably create serial killers. Lopez's case likely represents a confluence of factors: possible genetic predispositions towards psychopathy, severe early trauma that occurred during critical developmental periods, lack of intervention or treatment, and perhaps most importantly, a series of choices he made throughout his life that progressively deepened his commitment to violence. His first murders in prison, killing the inmates who'd raped him, represented a choice. His decision to begin killing young girls after his release represented a choice. His systematic hunting, his selection of vulnerable victims, his ritualistic methods, all of these involved planning, intentionality, and choice. The danger of overemphasizing trauma as an explanation for violence is that it can seem to excuse the inexcusable, to suggest that perpetrators are merely victims themselves acting out their damage on others. But accepting that trauma may have contributed to Lopez's development doesn't absolve him of responsibility for his actions. Many survivors of worse abuse than Lopez claimed to have experienced have become healers, advocates, protectors. The abuse didn't predetermine his path. It may have influenced it, but ultimately Lopez chose evil. As of 2026, 46 years after Pedro Lopez's arrest, the case continues to reverberate through South American society and beyond. In Ecuador, the maximum prison sentence was extended from 16 to 25 years in the aftermath of Lopez's inadequate sentence, a direct legislative response to the public outrage over his case. While this change came too late to affect Lopez himself, it represented an acknowledgement that the legal system had failed and needed to be reformed. Child protection organizations throughout South America have used Lopez's case as a cautionary example in their advocacy for better systems to track missing children, improved investigation of disappearances from marginalized communities, and increased resources for protecting street children and indigenous youth. The Ecuadorian National Police incorporated lessons from the Lopez investigation into their training programs, teaching officers about the patterns and methods of serial offenders, the importance of connecting cases across jurisdictions, and the need to take missing persons reports seriously even when the victims come from populations that might otherwise be overlooked. Universities in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru have developed criminology and forensic psychology courses that examine the Lopez case as a prime example of law enforcement failures, psychological profiling, and the social conditions that enable predators to operate undetected. But perhaps the most important legacy is the one carried by the survivors, the families who lost daughters, the communities that were terrorized, the people who continue to live with the knowledge of what happened and the uncertainty of what might still be happening. There are women in their 40s and 50s now who remember being young girls in Ecuadorian marketplaces when Pedro Lopez was hunting. They remember their mother's warnings, the sudden restrictions on their freedom, the fear that permeated their communities. Some of them knew victims personally, girls who were there one day and vanished the next. These women are raising their own children now, and the lessons they learned during those terrifying years inform how they parent. The trauma has been transmitted across generations, shaping family dynamics, community attitudes, and cultural approaches to child safety. There are also the siblings of victims, children who grew up in homes shadowed by grief and loss, who watched their parents struggle with unanswered questions and inadequate justice. Many of them have become advocates themselves, working to ensure that no other families have to endure what theirs did, fighting for better laws, better investigations, better protection for vulnerable children. And there are the investigators, now retired, who still think about the case, who wonder if Lopez is alive, who carry the weight of knowing they did everything possible within a system that ultimately failed to deliver justice. This is the question that haunts everyone familiar with the case. Where is Pedro López? The most optimistic scenario is that he died years ago, perhaps shortly after his disappearance in 1999. Natural causes, an accident, or perhaps violence at the hands of someone who recognized him and took justice into their own hands. This would mean that he's no longer a threat, that there are no additional victims beyond those already known. But there's no evidence for this scenario. No body was ever found. No death was ever reported. No credible information has emerged to suggest that Lopez is dead. The most pessimistic scenario is that Lopez is still alive and has been killing intermittently over the past 27 years, selecting victims from populations whose disappearances continue to go largely uninvestigated. If he returned to his pattern of targeting indigenous children, street youth, and girls from impoverished communities in remote areas, it's entirely possible that his crimes could have continued without being connected to his known history. This scenario is terrifying but not implausible. If Lopez is alive at 77, he might have reduced his frequency of killing due to age and physical limitations, but he might still be capable of occasional opportunistic crimes. And if he's operating in areas with limited law enforcement presence, using different methods to avoid detection, he could have added dozens more victims to his count without anyone realizing. A middle scenario is that Lopez is alive but no longer killing, either because age has made it physically impossible or because fear of being caught has finally outweighed his compulsions. He might be living under an assumed identity in a remote village, an elderly man with a terrible secret, waiting to die of natural causes while his crimes fade into history. The truth is that we simply don't know, and that uncertainty is itself a form of ongoing victimization for the communities Lopez terrorized. Every unsolved disappearance of a young girl in Colombia, Ecuador, or Peru raises the question, could it be him? Every unidentified body discovered raises the same terrible uncertainty. The 2005 decision by Interpol to deactivate his warrant remains controversial and poorly explained. Was it based on credible information suggesting his death? Was it simply an administrative decision based on the age of the case? Or was it a quiet acknowledgement that, after decades of searching, law enforcement had concluded that Lopez would never be found? Families of victims deserve answers to these questions. They deserve to know if the man who murdered their daughters is alive or dead, free or imprisoned, still killing or finally stopped. But as each year passes without news, without sightings, without resolution, those answers seem increasingly unlikely to ever come. The case of Pedro López forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, about evil, and about the value we place on different human lives. It reveals the stark reality that our systems of law and protection are not equally applied to all people. The girls Lopez targeted were vulnerable precisely because they came from communities that society had already marginalized and overlooked. Their lives were considered less valuable, their disappearances less urgent, their deaths less deserving of resources and attention. It demonstrates the catastrophic consequences when multiple systems fail simultaneously, when police don't investigate thoroughly, when jurisdictions don't communicate, when laws are inadequate to address extreme crimes, when monitoring of released offenders is insufficient. Each failure created an opportunity for Lopez to continue killing, and the accumulated weight of those failures translated directly into hundreds of stolen lives. It raises profound questions about punishment and rehabilitation. Is there any sentence adequate for someone who murders hundreds of children? Is rehabilitation even possible for someone who lacks the fundamental capacity for empathy that makes us human? Should such individuals ever be released, regardless of sentencing laws or claims of good behavior? And it leaves us with the terrible knowledge that monsters are real, that they walk among us wearing ordinary faces, that they exploit the gaps in our systems and the vulnerabilities in our communities, and that sometimes they walk free while their victims remain forever in the ground. The mothers at the Plaza Rosa marketplace in Ambato who caught Pedro López and nearly killed him that Sunday in March 1980 understood something essential, that when systems fail to protect the innocent, when authorities prove inadequate to the task, ordinary people must step forward. They saved Maria Povda through their vigilance and their courage. They caught a monster through their collective action. But one marketplace, one Sunday, one prevented abduction couldn't undo the hundreds of murders that had already occurred. It couldn't bring justice to the families Lopez had destroyed. It couldn't repair the systems that had failed so catastrophically. All it could do was save one girl, and in a story as dark as this one, that has to be enough to hold on to. One girl who went home to her mother. One child who grew up, who had a future, who was spared the fate of hundreds of others. Her survival is a small light in an overwhelming darkness. But it's a light nonetheless, a reminder that vigilance matters, that protection matters, that the instincts of mothers and communities matter, and that sometimes ordinary people can stop monsters, even when systems fail. The monster of the Andes is out there somewhere, alive or dead, free or in an unmarked grave. And hundreds of young girls remain in graves scattered across 3 countries, their names often forgotten, their futures stolen, their families still grieving decades later. This is their story. This is the accounting of what was done to them and the terrible inadequacy of the justice that followed. May they be remembered not as statistics in a serial killer's tally, but as individual human beings who deserved protection, who deserved safety, who deserved the chance to grow up and live full lives. And may the lessons of their deaths inspire us to do better, to protect the vulnerable more fiercely, to pursue justice more vigorously, and to never forget that behind every number, every statistic, every crime report, is a real person with a real family who loved them and a real future that was stolen away. The monster of the Andes took so much. We owe his victims the commitment to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again.